Hello everyone and welcome back to another edition here on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, Christopher Shepard. Thank you all for tuning into today's show. Happy Tuesday here on this lovely Tuesday afternoon. We are going to be talking a lot about certain things in the fantasy football world, including last night's game between the Dolphins and the Rams. Highly unusual, not many good fantasy performances, but still we look at them ever the same. Then we go on to the waiver wire. Some hidden gems still out there, potentially to pick up for a late fantasy playoff push if you feel like you need to supplement your team. Of course, continuing to talk about our positional rankings, running back and wide receiver for today, and concluding today's show with my fact versus fiction segment, presenting some bold fantasy takes for the week and either justifying them or debunking them. But before we get into any of that good stuff, I do want to remind you yet again that if you want more content such as this or exclusive short content, please consider liking, following, and subscribing to this show on the network, not just on YouTube, but anywhere you can find us on Twitch, Geo7, other websites, what have you. But if you do want to interact more directly with the show and communicate and interact with me personally, consider making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. Great way, like I say, keep this show as interactive as possible. Just makes it that much better. It's greatly appreciated. You can do one of two things. Either click that $sign in the chat box in the comments section, leave a tip or donation, or go to our website, gsmcpodcast.net, or also just leave any burning questions, comments, or concerns you have throughout the show about anything I talk about, or just something you might be wanting to know about. Fantasy advice, trade advice, what have you. I am all ears. Without further ado, let's jump into our first segment of the day, and that will be our Monday Night Football recap. Like I said, it was not the prettiest of games, not the prettiest in terms of a fantasy perspective either. Highly defensive stalemate here between these two teams. But ultimately, the Dolphins pulling off the shocking upset in LA, 23-15. And I was truly impressed with what the Dolphins were able to do, not just offensively in the short periods of time where that offense got moving, but on the defensive side of the football. They had a lot of injuries, especially in the secondary in that game, very late as well. So the Rams, hypothetically, could have come back and they had more opportunities, but I was really impressed by how, despite all those injuries in their secondary, they were able to hold up and ultimately keep the Rams from even scoring a touchdown. They did their job spectacularly last night. But we also have to look at the offenses. And the offenses weren't necessarily pretty. Even the Dolphins, which moved the football, I believe, a little bit more effectively than the Rams. They were able to punch in a couple of chances when they got into the red zone, whereas the Rams struggled in that area of the field. And so I do want to acknowledge these defenses, especially the Dolphins, and we'll get to them in a minute. But I also have to look at the kind of ugly nature of this game on the offensive side of the football. Let's start off with the performances of the quarterbacks. Let's start off with Tua in particular, because there were some really nice things that Tua did in this game, but there were a lot of plays that he and a lot of fans of the Dolphins perhaps would have wanted to take back. It was 20 of 28, 207 yards, 1 touchdown, 1 interception, only 8.18 fantasy points on the night for him in this one, but he still got the job done. There was a lot I liked. He was able to find the holes in the Rams secondary over the linebackers, and I really liked the route concepts that McDaniel was coming up for him, and he wasn't necessarily forcing the issue. That being said, still took too many big hits, took a lot of sacks, and ultimately plays that you don't necessarily want to have happen to someone like Tua, who's already been injured and concussed, especially so many times before. So while Tua played, quote-unquote, the better of the two, even though comparing him to Matthew Stafford last night isn't necessarily the best example, he still had some negative plays that he would have to eliminate from his game should, this win bolster and help elevate the chances of the Dolphins going on a late run here. And the reason why I was non-committal about Tua's performance was because of the fact that I was more impressed by the defense, and we'll get to them in a minute. But Tua's performance week in, week out seems to be serviceable in nature. Yes, we know how excellent he can be. We know how this Dolphins team looks with him at the helm rather than a guy like Thompson or Tyler Huntley. So it's going to be all about how Tua plays within himself, plays within the structure of the offense, and most importantly, preserves himself. Because I do feel this win is a positive for the Dolphins. It's a stepping stone for this stretch run for them, because they are still very much in playoff contention, that loaded bottom half of the AFC. So if Tua can continue to, play supplementary/complementary football in this offense, then I think the Dolphins are as good as gold to potentially go on a sneaky little run there in the AFC. On the other side of things, Matthew Stafford, pretty disappointing. Threw the football a lot, 46 times, 32 completions, 293 yards, 1 interception, 9.72 fantasy points. He did have some very nice throws, but the problems with this offense came in the red zone. Simply could not punch it in, especially on that last drive when they kicked the field goal, then went to the onside. It was very disappointing for the Rams to come away from that possession without, a touchdown when they could have had it. So, Matthew Stafford, I'm also non-committal about in terms of this performance, because I feel like, he was doing things right in the open field. He had a nice rapport going with both Kupp and Nakua, also incorporating guys like Robinson and Parkinson into this scheme. But he fell up short in the red zone, and that's what mattered in this game. And I do feel like the Dolphins secondary could have been exploited a little bit more later in this game, especially in that late fourth quarter where there were so many injuries in that secondary for that Dolphins team. But it is what it is. Matthew Stafford's going to have to erase this game from his memory and continue to go again, because he's going to have multiple opportunities, especially in that NFC West division. Win your divisional games if you're the Rams, and chances are you could sneak into the playoffs. So this game, it's not necessarily sweat off the back. It's kind of a disappointing setback for this Rams team, but they go again. And I feel like Matthew Stafford will go again. Let's stick with the Rams in terms of the fantasy perspective still before we give our full plaudits to the Dolphins defense. Let's talk about the only true positive on the offensive side of the football. It's not a receiver, it's a kicker, which just goes to show how important kickers can be from a fantasy perspective. Joshua Carty, a very impressive rookie out of Stanford, 5 for 6 in terms of field goals, a couple of 50-yarders too, a total of 18 fantasy points. That's like a little over wide receiver 2 projections in terms of point production from a kicker, a rookie kicker at that. And as these kickers improve, they're starting to become more and more integral in terms of how you view them from a fantasy perspective. Because a lot of college kickers as well, if you monitor things such as that, which you probably might not, but it's still pretty interesting, are beginning to elongate their range. And it's showing up in terms of how they translate to the NFL, and most importantly, into how they translate on paper and fantasy. Because these stats are unheard of for a rookie kicker who a quote-unquote peripheral playoff team are entrusting with that job. And so, in this game, when the Rams couldn't get anything going, for him to make 5 of 6 field goals, effectively do his job, is pretty impressive. So kudos to Joshua Carty for stepping up in a highly difficult game for this Rams offense. And now let's get into the Dolphins defense. 1 interception, 1 fumble recovery, 4 sacks, only 9 points in terms of fantasy, perhaps because of the field goals the Rams hit, but ultimately highly impressive front-to-back performance from the Dolphins in terms of the front seven. Calais Campbell taking it back a couple decades with that performance, playing much younger than his 36 years of age. On the back end, I talked about them a lot. A lot of injuries to different guys like Kohu, like Cam Smith, the backup. It's like had to keep on rotating in and out, but they still held their own and ultimately kept the Rams out of the end zone all night long. So kudos to the Dolphins defense, even though not necessarily showing up stats-wise in terms of fantasy production, still a fantastic performance for this Dolphins defense. And last but not least, a guy who I kind of wanted to pinpoint, maybe could have dropped him in my waiver wire segment coming up next, but still a very intriguing performance from this young man. How about Malik Washington? I was talking to my dad during the game about this guy because I could not believe what I heard when I heard his name. The rookie out of Virginia, someone who I hadn't heard of since his game-winning touchdown and upset of North Carolina last year. And seeing him in this Dolphins offense, he really looked like someone who could become their next gadget guy. 2 touches, 35 yards, 1 touchdown, a pretty pedestrian 10.5 points. Pretty unordinary, mundane performance, but still one of note in terms of how the Dolphins use certain players and get the most out of their traits in this offense. They can continue finding guys late in drafts and developing them into potent weapons that they can use on the perimeter. Then chances are this offense is going to continue to grow and mature under Mike McDaniel. Malik Washington looks like a gem. And he was perhaps the bright spot in this Dolphins offense because much like the Rams, they didn't necessarily move the ball that much outside of the Malik Washington touchdown and a touchdown later in the game. But it was noteworthy that they can find this guy and get him some meaningful touches in his first NFL touchdown in this one. So kudos and congratulations to Malik Washington on a very intriguing game. Let me know what you think of the comments about this game. Pretty weird one from a fantasy pinpoint perspective. But coming up after this short break, we'll be talking about the waiver wire. Which hidden gems could still be out there and help you in terms of making a fantasy playoff push. We're going to talk about that right after this short break.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits, some losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip, you choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Before we get into our second segment of the day on the show, I do want to remind you yet again that if you wish to interact with the show a little bit more directly, consider making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. Great way to contribute and interact with the show. You can do one of two things. Either click that $ in the chat box in the comments section, or go to our website, gsmcpodcast.net, leave a tip or donation, or just leave any burning questions, comments, or concerns you might have throughout the show in our comments section. I will read them on air. I love hearing your guys' opinion. I'm all ears. It's greatly appreciated. It just makes this show that much better. But without further ado, let us jump into our waiver wire segment, our second segment here on today's show. I love talking about the waiver wire, even as we get deeper and deeper into the season. all of these guys can still contribute to your fantasy team. For example, if you're still in the thick of a playoff run and are worried about finding certain options for your team to further supplement it, or just want even more of an edge and you're sitting pretty just waiting for the fantasy football playoffs to come, these players are all very intriguing in their own right, because now we're in the period of the year in the NFL where we know certain things about certain teams, and thus we know how certain players can be viewed on these teams. And so, importance-wise, it's going to be really intriguing how you guys think about it. So let me know what you think in the comments about these players, because they're from a wide range of different kinds of teams, whether they be contenders or teams who feel like they're kicking the can down the line to next year. So it's going to be a very intriguing segment as we go on throughout the year and we get deeper and deeper into the thick of it in the NFL playoff race and fantasy playoff race. Without further ado, let's jump right into this waiver wire segment. Starting off with a guy on a contender who can be a very underrated option. He's been a journeyman wide receiver in the league for several years, with the Raiders, with the Dolphins, finding a home in Buffalo, and looking like someone who, as the season gets into the playoff push, can be someone for this Buffalo team that can make a name for himself. And not for nothing, when I think about this Bills skill position group, if there are going to be certain injuries, quote-unquote the Amari Cooper one, to worry about, you're going to need some unsung heroes to step up. And that's what I think Mac Hollins can do. Leading receiver for the Bills in that game against Indy. No touchdowns though, but still finding his rhythm, being a reliable receiver, whether it be in late downs, in the red zone, in the middle of the field. Just someone who can be a security blanket at the wide receiver position for Josh Allen. And I think he's beginning to trust him more and more. Maybe that changes once Amari Cooper comes back and he becomes a weapon in his own right. But if you know things get awry with this Bills skill position group, Mac Hollins can be someone who can step up. He's been an experienced receiver, like I said, been in many different offensive systems, perhaps this one being his most comfortable in terms of schematics. But at the end of the day, if you're a fantasy football manager, these are the kinds of players you want to look out for. Guys who can grow into their roles as the season goes on, especially if they're contenders and you know they're going to make deep playoff runs for you to monitor once the fantasy playoffs come along as well. And speaking of interesting receivers and interesting journeyman receivers, this time not necessarily a contender, but doing fantastic spot duty for this New Orleans team. How about Marquise Valdes-Scantling? I was really tempted yesterday to include him in my fantasy starts of the week, but I said no, I gotta save him for my waiver wires because he's most likely still out there. Been someone who's been around the block in the NFL. Hasn't really found a home, but has had spurts of excellence throughout his career, whether it be with the Green Bay Packers, believe with the Raiders for a little bit of time as well, and now with the New Orleans Saints amidst their injury crisis in that wide receiver room. Rashid Shaheed out for a little bit, Chris Olave out for a little bit, Bub Means as well out for a little bit, and he steps up in that big game against the Falcons. Maybe not a win that you can say, well, they can get back on track and make a playoff push, but still a very positive win in the first game of the Darren Rizzi era for however long that is going to be. Just goes to show, sometimes, in moments of crisis are when unsung heroes rise from the ashes, and that's what MVS did. When the Saints needed him most, he really was someone that I feel like Derek Carr really appreciated in that game as an explosive play threat. And he could be as the Saints either ride out the season or try and actually make a go of it. And so look out for him to, whether or not the Saints improve off this win or not, be someone who can be very effective from a fantasy perspective. Now let's go to kind of a bad take here. I did write this before the games happened, but I still feel like when I look at this Cowboys team, Cooper Rush still is the best option for them. I know a lot of people might be saying Trey Lance should play some more, see what they have in him, whether or not he can take over from Dak in the future. But I think for now, if you're the Cowboys, this season is over. So you gotta ride out Cooper Rush, who is technically the worst of the two in terms of raw talent and ability, but still can get the job done. That loss only dropped him to 5-2 in his career, and it was against an Eagles team that's steadily improving, becoming a fearsome opponent, not just in the NFC East, but in the entire National Football League. But here's why Cooper Rush can still improve and still be the right answer for the Cowboys for the rest of the season. I think they have nothing to lose, and quite frankly, while the NFC East could be a tough division to navigate, I still feel like the Cowboys, can have some wins in them, can shock a couple teams. They play the Texans, a tough game, and the Commanders, another tough one. But they have the Giants, a Bengals defense that still hasn't really impressed me over the last couple of weeks, the Panthers, the Bucks, and they rounded the season with the Eagles and Commanders. So I feel like this schedule is one in which Cooper Rush, the more experienced hand, can at least semi-thrive in, if not, be serviceable enough to keep them in games. And so that's why I feel like I'm not necessarily pressing the panic button on Cooper Rush just yet. And I'll mention this a little bit later in another segment about him as well. But he still is the most competent option, in my opinion, in that QB room for Dallas right now. And then let's go into a little bit more NFC East flavor here. Jeremy McNichols. Let's talk about this guy, because I think I talked about him a little bit before in this segment a couple weeks ago, where I talked also about the depth and versatility of that Washington Commanders running back room. I've really been impressed with him as someone who can supplement what Austin Eckler and Brian Robinson Jr. can bring for the time being, actually being, I believe, still the RB2 as Brian Robinson's recovering from injury. Don't quote me on that. But he still, even as an RB3, is someone who has great effect in this roster for Washington, especially in the red zone. Very physical kind of guy. Also has a little bit of explosiveness in his game. Meaning not someone who can, in the open field, make big plays like an Eckler can, but still someone who, when you look at running back rooms around the league, is perhaps the best RB3 a team could possibly have. And if you're the Commanders and you really think you've got something going on offense, chances are, in the playoffs, Jaden Daniels is going to look a little bit flustered. And so you're going to need this running back room to truly supplement him, to lift him up, to elevate him once they get into the playoffs. So look for Jeremy McNichols to be a big part of that in that rotation. And last but not least, let's talk about a young man in the NFC West. Truly miraculous story. Ricky Pearsall. Someone who, like I said, suffered a nearly fatal gunshot wound. In fact, doctors said it was miraculous that he was still alive. Now playing football, catching his first ever NFL touchdown. It's truly remarkable to see where he was on that fateful night to now performing admirably in a 49ers uniform. Just someone who I feel like for the 49ers is just another depth piece for them to utilize in that very scary offense when it is healthy, I might add. But still, if Ricky Pearsall can be another great generational wide receiver talent that the 49ers can develop, look out, because yes, there's going to be a lot of contract situations in the very near future that the 49ers have to figure out, but Ricky Pearsall's a gem. I feel like he can really be one of the better receivers they have found and developed through all these drafts in the Shanahan era. And if they tie down Brock Purdy and say, okay, we're going to have to cut some of our losses here, get rid of some guys, I feel like Ricky Pearsall can step in and fill, say, a Brandon Ayuk or Jawan Jennings' shoes. because of how versatile he can be. And if that performance against Tampa Bay stands up against the test of time, we're going to be sitting here thinking that Ricky Pearsall can be someone who you would draft, potentially even in, say, the 4th or 5th round of a fantasy draft in years to come. And if you're in a dynasty league, you should be really looking at him heavily because of that opportunity for growth. Now, obviously, this 49ers offense is still having a little bit of struggles, even though Christian McCaffrey is fully back from that tendonitis issue. I still feel like, this is one of those opportunities where the 49ers can still tinker with a lot of what they do schematically on offense. And so, Ricky Pearsall, this isn't just a aberration. This isn't just a one-trick pony performance. This is something that I think can continue as the season goes on, because I think that this wide receiver room and this scheme is so versatile and versatile enough for a guy like Ricky Pearsall to be noticeable. Let me know what you think in the comments about this. I feel like all of these players that I talked about can help you along the stretch, especially if you're just looking to supplement your team and you're sitting high and mighty in first place or second in your fantasy rankings, or you're kind of in the middle of the pack and want to make a playoff push. All of these players, I believe, can help you no matter what their real-life situations are and what your fantasy situation is. So, before we go into a quick break, just remember, chess is similar to fantasy. You always have to think ahead. And so, you may not like many of these players that I've just mentioned, but I feel like you have to be proactive no matter where you are in the standings. And so, just take this with a grain of salt, because some of this might not work out. But still, proactivity is key in the fantasy football world. But when we come back from our short break, we're going to be continuing our positional rankings with the running back position. Who do I think will shine the brightest in that department when we come back?
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free.
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. And for our third segment of the day here on the show, we continue with our positional rankings for Week 11 of the NFL season with the running back position. Now I feel like this is the most settled position in fantasy football right now, because we're starting to see a pattern here. We're starting to see the cream of the crop, the tier 1 guys, continue to perform at a lofty standard. We're also starting to see some mid-tier guys separate themselves from the pack. We're starting to see potentially tier 3, tier 2.5, I like to call it, guys, move up firmly into tier 2 or maybe even low-end tier 1 roles. And so I feel like this group of guys for Week 11 was truly representative of that trend at the running back position especially. All 4 of them had potential to be guys who late in the season can help you, like I said, in a fantasy playoff push, but also continue to consistently perform. That's what I feel best describes all 4 of these guys. They're paragons of consistency no matter how they pan out week in, week out. I feel like you can rely upon them almost steadily enough to guarantee them as starters week in, week out. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. Starting off, perhaps the most guaranteed starter of them all, going up against the Steelers in a very important AFC North battle, Derrick Henry. Actually, his kind of most pedestrian performance of the season against Cincinnati in that offensive shootout, out of all the players who did not perform, he being the most surprisingly 14.1 fantasy points, but still, even against this tough Steelers defense, this tough physical defensive front, I feel like Derrick Henry is just going to out-physical them. I feel like that's the Ravens' game plan some of the time. When they're facing these very aggressive defensive fronts, they kind of wait them out, potentially do some design runs with Lamar, try and stay in the short to intermediate areas of the field, and then later in the game bring out the big gun in Derrick Henry, who, after this defense gets wear down, can really shine bright later in this game. And so that's what I feel like this game plan will be for the Ravens. He's not necessarily going to do too much early in the game, but look for him especially late in the third, into the fourth quarter, to really ramp up and get that fantasy production we know he can. And it's going to be important to see how this Ravens team consistently tries to maintain drives against the Steelers defense, because time of possession is going to be key in this game. I feel like the Steelers are going to move a little bit faster and looser on the offensive side of the football with Russell Wilson and his ability to hit some deep shots. With the Ravens, I feel like will be more tactical about it. I feel like they're going to pick and choose their spots to hurt the Steelers defense, because I feel like the Steelers defense is one of the most well-rounded in the league, but I still think there are some flaws in that secondary that I can pinpoint. And I feel like, if Lamar can be efficient early in the game in the pass game, then he can turn it over to Derrick Henry late, and that's where you can really get down and gritty in this game with Derrick Henry. And so I feel like, even though the matchup doesn't necessarily look the best, because of his physicality, because of the way the Ravens will game plan for this, I feel like he is a guaranteed starter for this week, potentially the best start of the week in that department. Now, our second guy I want to talk about, potentially a little less consistent throughout the season, but over the past couple of games has really risen and ascended the rankings of the running back position to now be someone who I feel like can start for you for the rest of the season. Also playing this game, by the way, Najee Harris. Not necessarily the best of performances for him against Washington, a little bit of decline from what we've seen from him in the past 3 or 4 weeks. But against this Ravens team, I feel like he has a little bit of an easier task than even Henry has in this game. The Ravens front, a little bit weakened. They obviously lost their leader in that department in Patrick Queen. Still have a guy in Justin Madubuike, who I really like in the center of the field, center of the defense for them. But still, I think a lot of people will complain about this Ravens secondary, but I think this Ravens defensive front is a little bit susceptible. And so, if they don't generate pressure, if they're not aggressive in the run game, if they don't set the edge, set the tone, and dictate the line of scrimmage, then Najee Harris will go off against them. And he can get into the second level. And I feel like, the Steelers' offensive line has been steadily improving week in, week out. And so, I feel like, should the Steelers play well in terms of their line play, dictate the line themselves, then Najee Harris can be someone who can really create explosive plays with his after-contact ability and getting into that second level, because second-level runs are going to be key as well in this game. Not just time of possession, because if your running backs can create the occasional explosive play, chances are that will play into the Steelers' strengths, because they might want this game to turn into a shootout, right? Because they feel they can take advantage of the Ravens' defense. And no matter how many points Lamar puts up, they feel they can put up more. So I feel like second-level runs, especially for a guy like Najee Harris, will be integral into who wins this game. So look for Najee Harris to kind of be the more effective and efficient of the two in that department in this game, and that is why I feel, in terms of fantasy production, he will be someone you should monitor for this weekend as well. And the third guy, perhaps a little less consistent than both of these guys already mentioned, but I still like him in my personal fantasy team. Week in, week out, it's going to depend on the matchups a little bit more with this guy. But this one, I feel like he can take advantage of in terms of how aggressive he might want to play. And this is James Cook against the Chiefs. Still had 15.5 fantasy points versus Indy. Not too shabby in that department. But this is a different animal for the Bills. And I feel like this Chiefs run defense is perhaps the best in the National Football League, if not the best overall defense as well. And so what the Bills need to do is try and create as many chunk plays as possible. And no back, I believe, is better in the league at doing that than James Cook. One of the more physical early down backs in the National Football League. And I feel like, the way the Bills might go about it is they might want to stretch the Kansas City front out a little bit, go a little bit horizontally along the line with their play. But I still feel like, running it up the gut with James Cook could be an effective strategy to really try and attack that interior of the line, while with Chris Jones and Karlaftis playing some of their best football. And so, yes, it's a risky pick, but I still feel it favors James Cook if they are aggressive in their run schemes. It's all going to come down to how Joe Brady views this game. Because I feel like he might want Josh Allen to have a little bit more control in this one, but also wants to protect the football as well. So it's going to come down to a steady diet of James Cook runs, potentially a little bit more screen action than we've seen from the Bills over the past couple of weeks. And that plays into this James Cook role here on the offensive side of the football. It should be a very exciting game, a huge chess match of one that I feel will favor the Chiefs early on, but like I said, it's all about wearing down that front. Nobody truly has tried it to good results, but if there's anyone who I feel can help it and most importantly elevate their offense by doing it, it's James Cook, because he is someone who, like I said, isn't necessarily going to always be important and versatile in the run game, but also in the receiving game as well. And should they go to the screen early and often, that's where he's going to make his bread and butter in this one. So look for James Cook to be highly effective in this one as well. But our final running back I'm going to talk about did not necessarily perform well last night. Pretty disappointing performance from him against Miami. But against the Pats, I feel like can be more effective. Even though, this Pats defense is a little bit stingier than I thought, I still think Kyren Williams is going to be someone to monitor. 11.2 fantasy points actually against that Miami defense last night. And, I think that was just a minor blip for the Rams. It was not indicative of what I think the Rams will look like for the rest of the year. What I think they're going to look like is a truly complementary offense where Kyren Williams is effective in the run, can get to the second level, create chunk plays in early downs, and ultimately open up the passing game for Matthew Stafford and Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua. So, against the Patriots, a team who, yes, is a stingy kind of defense, but hasn't necessarily beaten anyone of note in that department, I feel like Kyren Williams will round back into form in this one. And I feel like it goes hand in hand with how Matthew Stafford plays as well, because if Matthew Stafford feels pressure, chances are he's going to go to the running game a little bit more. And I was shocked that they didn't necessarily utilize the run as often when Matthew Stafford struggled last night as they should have. And so I think they learned their lesson in that Miami game, and now they go into New England and figure everything out against a Pats team that's still very weak in every single department. Not just on offense, but on defense still. Even though, like I said, it can cause you problems. But I feel like, Kyren Williams has been consistent enough, whereas I'm not too worried about one blip on his record. And so that's why I feel like this performance can be one that gets him back on track and ultimately is indicative of how the Rams can look as they try and make an NFC West title run and most importantly, try and get into the playoffs as well. Let me know what you think in the comments about my running back rankings, because coming up next, we transition and continue with our positional rankings with the wide receivers. Interesting position to look at for this week. We'll be right back after this short break to talk about them.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available every...
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. And for our fourth segment of the day here on the show, we are going to be continuing our positional rankings with our wide receivers. Another position that I feel is starting to get a little bit defined, but still has some players I'm a little confused about. And this list is going to be indicative of that. I feel like the 4 players I've selected all come from different tiers, and in certain matchups I feel can or cannot be favorable. But I feel like this was definitely a very matchups-oriented week in the NFL, and so that's what I went with in terms of trying to figure out who I believe will perform well in Week 11. So without further ado, let's jump right into this wide receiver rankings for, like I said, Week 11 of the NFL season. Starting off with one of, if not the most consistent wide receiver performers in fantasy, and it will be shocking once you hear the name Terry McLaurin. He has been, in my humble opinion, someone who I can't take my eyes away from in terms of real life, and someone who you have to closely monitor in fantasy. I feel like this guy, now with steady quarterback play and a system that wants to get in the ball deep and downfield, has really elevated his game and shown that he's one of the premier wide receivers in the National Football League. This is perhaps his toughest matchup yet against an Eagles team looking to kind of take over the NFC East reins yet again. But I think he's going to be an X factor in this one, and you can't ignore this matchup for him. 16.3 fantasy points against Pittsburgh, and I still think he's continuing to evolve his game, and as the season goes on, whether or not, the Commanders kind of collapse a little bit or continue to shine, Terry McLaurin is always going to be someone who I look at and go, this is a guy who has to continuously be starting in fantasy leagues around the NFL and around fantasy football circles for years to come, because now he can perform better than ever. And I feel like in this matchup, even though it's a difficult matchup, Thursday night prime time against your division rival, the chief rival for that NFC East title, Terry McLaurin is going to prove that win or lose, he's one of the best competitors at the position in the league, and still someone who warrants a look at in fantasy football circles everywhere, because I feel like over the years, a lot of people were skeptical of him because they knew his talent but didn't trust his quarterback enough that, he would suffer from bad quarterback play. But now he has Jaden Daniels. I think this is the season where everyone's starting to appreciate him a little bit more, and so look for him to be very popular as the season goes on and as they get into the playoffs for Terry McLaurin to really shine. And then the second receiver I want to talk about is someone who's a little bit on the weirder side. Hasn't really had a breakout season, much like Terry McLaurin has had inconsistent quarterback play throughout his career, but still, much like Terry McLaurin, kind of a Terry McLaurin light in a certain regard. Can push the ball downfield, can get vertical, and most importantly, is really starting to mature in this Denver Broncos offense. It's Courtland Sutton against a pitiful Falcons pass defense. 19 points against KC, which is nothing to sneeze at considering the excellence of that defense, now going up against one of the worst pass defenses in the NFL after what Marquise Valdes-Scantling of all people did to them. Look for Courtland Sutton in an easy matchup here for him to really show his true colors here. I love what he can be in the Sean Payton offense. And it's not an offense, that predicates itself on the vertical passing game, which is why I think Russell Wilson suffered a little bit in that system. It is a more timing-based offense. I still feel Courtland Sutton is the most effective receiver because I don't see anyone else in that Denver Broncos wide receiver room who impresses me other than him and can do what is necessary for this offense to maintain its levels than Courtland Sutton. And I feel like Bo Nix is most comfortable when throwing to him down the field because he knows his traits. And so look for him early enough in what could be a shootout to go to Courtland Sutton. And for Courtland Sutton to prove why he still has a lot of raw talent upside in his NFL career. And maybe he proves that it's been the quarterback play over the past couple of years that has held him back rather than, his own struggles in terms of trying to make a name for himself in this Denver Broncos offense, because he stands alone, in my opinion, as the weapon to look out for the Denver Broncos, because they're winning football games by keeping it close enough that they feel they can make a late push to win the game, much like they tried to do against KC, and ultimately came up short because of an incredible blocked field goal, but we won't talk about that game. I feel like that's where Courtland Sutton can shine best. When they're pushing to win games late in the contest and they need some big plays. That's where Courtland Sutton can be most effective. And I feel like this game can come down to the wire for both the Falcons and Broncos. So look for him to be very effective later in this game, like I think he will be. Then the third guy I want to talk about, another kind of chalk pick at the wide receiver position week in, week out in a fantasy. Jamar Chase against the Chargers. Very difficult defensive task again, but he had a historic fantasy performance against the Baltimore Ravens. 55.4 fantasy points, the high score of the season so far from a single game perspective, and I think he's going to continue to do that. Yes, I like the Chargers defense, one of the more underrated defenses in the league. All their versatility, but they do have some secondary issues and some young pieces that I don't fully trust against a receiver of Jamar Chase's caliber. And so I feel like, this game might play into the Chargers' strengths a little bit because if they do slow down this Bengals offense, they feel like they can control the ball enough to where Joe Burrow can't hurt them. But it's going to be a difficult task because of the versatility of this offense and Jamar Chase being a big part of that. He can stretch the field, he can run routes effectively, hurt you early or late down, so his versatility is really going to be something the Chargers haven't seen before all season. They've really not faced an offense of this caliber yet, and so I feel like some flaws will be exposed for the Chargers in this one, and Jamar Chase will play a big role in that. And not for nothing, I also think T. Higgins might also have a day. I'm not going to mention him in this segment, but I think T. Higgins is also going to have a big game in this one because being occupied with those two receivers, if you're a Chargers defense that, yes, is one of the best defenses, one of the best scoring defenses in the league, you still, like I said, haven't had a challenge like this. This will be the game, I feel, where the Chargers kind of get a little bit exposed. And I feel like a big part of that, like I said, is going to come down to the receiver play for the Cincinnati Bengals. And the last guy, another guy who might be a little bit sketchy here, might be a little bit contentious in terms of fantasy circles. I feel like, he still is the best option potentially for this Indianapolis Colts team in that wide receiver room. If, he can get more touches and targets, but still it's going to depend on the play of who's ever at the quarterback position. Josh Downs, going up because of the Jets defense that has been exposed all season long, not living up to the standards they placed for themselves last year. And I feel like, Joe Flacco has a propensity to look at deep threat guys like A.D. Mitchell and Alec Pierce a little bit more highly in that offense, but Josh Downs, I feel like even more than Pittman, is becoming the most well-rounded receiver in that group. And so against the Jets, a defense where they feel like they can get momentum going, I feel like Josh Downs can have a big game here. And he's not someone who I would usually consider being a fantasy performer and a matchup-oriented one at that. But I really feel like Joe Flacco's going to start to appreciate him more once this Colts offense matures a little bit. Because I feel like it isn't necessarily Joe Flacco holding them back. I feel like it's this forced nature to try and play better because he's not Anthony Richardson. Because if it were Anthony Richardson, I do feel like this offense would not be as in rhythm as it would be under Joe Flacco. And it sounds crazy, I know, because Joe Flacco hasn't looked good so far. But I still think he's the more effective of the two, the more efficient of the two, and someone who's a little bit more, most importantly, ambitious in his play. And, if that continues to be the case, then Josh Downs can, get more touches and reps, because I feel like Joe Flacco's problem at this point has been, trying to understand the intricacies of this offense and who he can really trust. And so that's why Josh Downs hasn't been as effective in recent games, but this could be his breakout game in this Colts team. 14.2 fantasy points versus Buffalo, so he's on that wide receiver 2 projected level. So he's not any slouch here when it comes to, making big plays for this Colts team. He's not someone who I take lightly in this Colts offense. He is someone who I believe can be a threat. And if against the Jets they find themselves, trying to move the football a little bit more effectively and they need to pick up first downs, look for Josh Downs to be that guy. He might not be that intriguing, that sexy of a pick in fantasy, but he can get the job done for you, and I think he can do it on a more consistent basis as the Colts season progresses. Let me know what you think about this segment in the comments. I think that, the wide receiver position can be as defined one day as undefined the next. And so that's why I feel like we have to continue, like I say, to preach proactivity in terms of the fantasy community. Because never know which wide receiver or running back or QB can perform at a high standard. So that's why I make these lists. That's why I try and keep them as diverse as possible. But let me know what you think, because coming up next, we're going to transition to our kind of prediction segment of the day, our fact versus fiction segment, where I make some bold fantasy claims and either justify or debunk them. You definitely don't want to miss it to close out today's show right after this short break. Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. And for our final segment of the day here on the show, I do want to go over my fact versus fiction. Before we get into that, I do want to address a comment by Tap to Learn here. I like Downs too, but Flacco has still not repeated what he did last year with Cleveland. And I kind of agree with that sentiment, because I feel like a large part of what Flacco did last year was hit the deep shot, be aggressive in the short to intermediate areas of the field, and ultimately that's what unlocked that Cleveland offense. But I still don't necessarily think that Flacco has to be the everyman for the Colts. He just has to be serviceable enough for me to feel comfortable with me proclaiming that Josh Downs can be an effective fantasy wide receiver, because I believe in Josh Downs very highly. But it's all going to depend on, Flacco doing just enough to get this Indy offense going. But without further ado, let us get into our final segment of the day here on the show, our fact versus fiction segment, kind of along the lines of our Don't Be Surprised If segment here on the show, but more so justifying or debunking certain claims that people might make throughout the week from a fantasy perspective. And these ones, I must say, are wacky, including my final one. I did, granted, make this before Week 10's games even started, so a lot of unpredictability with this segment right now. Might have to talk about certain things off the cuff, but without further ado, let's jump right into it, because that's what makes it that much more exciting. And the first take kind of stems from a take that I had yesterday in my Don't Be Surprised If segment. So we're going to go over it again. It's about Seattle upsetting San Fran behind the stellar receiving efforts of that trio that you see on my screen, DK Metcalf, Tyler Lockett, and JSN. But the reason I think it's fiction is because only one part of that statement is going to come true. And when only one part becomes true, it has to be deemed as fiction. So, unfortunately, that means I don't have the Seahawks upsetting San Fran, as much as I feel like after the bye, they're coming back fresh. DK's coming back from that MCL sprain, and this offense, becomes a little bit more versatile potentially than what they were against San Fran a couple weeks ago. I still feel like, they're just going to shoot themselves in the foot in certain situations enough so that San Fran can take advantage of that. Because granted, San Fran still doesn't look like itself either. They just got back their own weapon, Christian McCaffrey, from injury, and they still had to wait for a last-minute field goal from Jake Moody, who granted had missed 3 field goals in that game, to put away a Tampa Bay Bucks team playing yet again without Mike Evans and Chris Godwin. So it's an interesting debate here, but I still don't think Seattle has the goods to beat San Fran just yet. We're still waiting for our first win in quite some time against San Fran, but I still think that these receivers can get going against the 49ers here. I still think, Geno can distribute the ball more effectively, more efficiently in this one than what he did in that last game. And so look for all 3 of these receivers to be viable fantasy options for you this weekend, even though I don't think this upset will happen. And that is why I have to, sadly, as a Seattle Seahawks fan, deem this one fiction. But I do think it can be an interesting game. Then the second one I want to talk about. We talk about this guy throughout the week. As always, Bo Nix is a very interesting fantasy proposition. And I think he could be a sneaky top 5 candidate at the QB position for the Broncos in this one. Against the Falcons, like I said, this is going to be a very, very exciting, thrilling matchup here between 2 teams that I feel like pride themselves on certain areas of their offense that other teams might not, in terms of game management, timing-based offense. And then on the defensive side of football, 2 teams that are starkly different, but I feel like why I think the Falcons will keep this close, and I don't want to digress too much from Bo Nix here, is because, that front of Denver is not necessarily the best out of all of the units in that defense for Denver. And I think that Bijan and Tyler Algier can take advantage of that, and they're going to want to go to the run game early, which can open up a little bit more passing avenues for Kirk. So look for them to try and keep this as close as possible if they're the Falcons. But on the Bo Nix side of things, the Broncos side of things, I feel like offensively in this one, all bets are off on how the Broncos look at this game. Because you look at this Falcons defense, they have some nice pieces, but they haven't really come together. And I feel like Bo Nix, still, like I said, has some erratic moments. That second half against the Chiefs, Prime example. Yes, it was a tough defense, but after you know what he did in the first half, taking them to that 14-3 lead and kind of being non-existent in that second half is a little bit worrying. So in this one, there are still going to be some questions asked of him in terms of his play, but I still think he'll be effective enough. Whether he's on the run with his legs or throwing the ball downfield to Courtland Sutton, to where I feel like he can produce nice numbers against this pretty bad Falcons pass defense. And so it is a bit of a risk take, but I still think it can be justified as fact just because of the ineptitudes of the Falcons offense and because I like what I'm seeing out of the progression of Bo Nix in this Sean Payton offense, because it's going to be all about timing with him. It's not necessarily, run game or pass game. It's going to be timing based, getting the tempo going, and if Bo Nix can do that to great effect against this defense that he can settle in against, then look for him to potentially crack the top 5 at his position, because I truly think that his progression is one to monitor from a fantasy perspective as well. Then, the third take I want to talk about here, Jaden Daniels. Potentially not going to be living up to his standards against Philly. And I think that, Jaden Daniels is not necessarily someone who you would say is going to be a 300, 350 plus yard passer. And that's why, this game could be a little bit skeptical, as Taplin says, is Denver too pass happy? Who are their backs? That's a good point, because, a large part of what Sean Payton wants to do is roll out Bo Nix, maybe have him on the run, and potentially in the play action game be a little bit more proactive. But I do like their backs a lot, even though they're not noticeable. They have guys like McLaughlin, like Williams, who can impact the game. Maybe not the deepest of running back rooms, but still guys who can set the tone in early downs and open up some avenues for Bo Nix in that offense. Maybe not over the past couple of weeks, because we've seen Bo Nix take more command, but they're certainly there, and they certainly have to be accounted for if you're Atlanta in this one, or else Bo Nix can wreak havoc on this defense. But getting back to the other rookie QB here against Philly, the reason why I think it's fiction is because Jaden Daniels has been truly ordinary in his extraordinariness, if that makes sense. He hasn't necessarily pushed too much. He hasn't necessarily forced the issue for the Commanders game in, game out. And he's played within himself. And he's played efficiently in Cliff Kingsbury's system. And he looks comfortable week in, week out. And against Philly, I don't think he's going to be daunted. I think the Commanders lose this game in a close one, but he's not going to be as daunted as some people might think. Because while it's the toughest matchup to date, and, this is for the NFC East, hypothetically, he did admirably against Pittsburgh, which is arguably a tougher defense. And he's been doing it all year long. And I feel like he's kind of in his own lane here in this rookie QB class because, questions are going to be asked, well, this is more of a college-style offense than some other guys who are rookies are playing. But it's what he's comfortable in doing, and if he can win football games with it and play efficient, turnover-free football, then why change it? Because he's proven that he can go toe-to-toe with some of the more competitive teams in the league and hold his own. So look for him to continue to be his efficient self in this one against Philly. And now, last but not least, perhaps the most embarrassing take I've ever had in the history of the show. Did write this before, the games happened, so I didn't get to see the ineptitudes of the Cowboys offense in full force before making this prediction, but I still think it holds merit. And that is Cooper Rush having an impact here on the Cowboys offense. Now, obviously, that was a disaster class against the Eagles, but it's the Eagles. And it's a team that the Cowboys shouldn't be expected to beat in this juncture of time this season. And so, yes, the schedule for them isn't necessarily the best, But there are going to be some moments where I feel like Cooper Rush can be impactful. From a fantasy perspective, this is more for you guys in Superflex, deeper leagues who are more concerned about depth than, say, 12-man leagues. Cooper Rush, I feel like the reason why he's going to be the most effective option going forward at the QB position for the Cowboys is because he has experience. And not for nothing, that loss against Philly only dropped his record to 5-2. That's still the best winning percentage of any quarterback. Yes, it's a small sample size, a minimum of 6 or 7 starts in this era. But I feel like, regardless of that, I feel like this offense needs to go back to basics. And Cooper Rush is the most back-to-basics quarterback, potentially, in the NFL right now. And so that's why I feel like he can be effective enough to generate some production for this offense and potentially, make it so that there's no pressure on anyone's shoulders here. Because now, they know Dak Prescott is out for the season. They can get away from all that hubbub surrounding the pressure he might face in that system. So Cooper Rush is a unique opportunity for him to really take control of this Cowboys team and say, hey, we got to look away from what Dak and CD brought to this team and get back to playing complimentary football, because that might be all they need to pick up a couple surprising wins along the way. But let me know what you think in the comments. This will just about do it for today's show. Thank you for tuning in. This has been the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. I've been Christopher Shepard. Thank you all for tuning in. We'll be back tomorrow at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Remember to like, follow, and subscribe to the show in the network if you want more content such as this, and also continue making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, Super Stickers features here on YouTube to contribute and interact with the show while it is live streaming. But other than that, I am out till tomorrow. Thank you all yet again.